kids. I'm hoping that you were able to kind of catch up on your Kids4Truth verses and you got maybe number 3 finished. And last week we did our lesson on number 4, so I'm hoping that you were able to get that done. So you're going to start working on number 5. So we're going to talk about this a little bit today. I'm going to show you these 4 letters, and I want you to see what they remind you of. Hopefully it reminds you of something that we learned in music time. We learned about a choir and how a choir has 4 different sections. There's 2 parts for men and there's 2 parts for ladies. And so the highest is the S, which is soprano, and the A is alto, and then the men sing the higher part is a tenor part, and the B is the bass part. So we're going to talk about this because when we have just one of those singing, we have just a melody. But when we add the different parts to it, it creates something we call in music harmony. I have kind of a funny story. When I was little, sometimes girls think about this sort of thing. When I grew up, when I had kids, I wanted to name them Melody and Harmony. I thought it would be if I had twins. Well, what you don't realize is God is in total control of that. And so obviously I didn't ever have twins. I think I liked twins because when I was growing up, my youth pastor and his wife had twins, and I babysat for them all growing up, so that was kind of fun. So anyway, that was my funny story about melody and harmony. I think those would be a little interesting for names, but that's kind of what I thought. So melody and harmony go together, and it sounds more interesting when you have more than one part playing at one time. Maybe you've tried to play the piano and you have just done one hand, but when you put the other hand with it, it sounds really nice when you put all of those together. Well, we're going to be talking about Adam and Eve when they were in the garden, and when they were first created and they were in the garden, they were enjoying something we could refer to as harmony, perfect harmony with God. That means they were enjoying being with God. They just got to walk and talk with him each day, and they were able to bring him glory, and they were so joyful and happy because there was no sin at all. So we're gonna go walk through this story today, and I want you to be thinking about, why did God have in this story a part where there was a tree in the garden that they couldn't eat out of, and they chose to eat out of that one tree? You know this story well. We're going to talk about, why did God put that one tree that they weren't supposed to eat out of in the garden? Couldn't he have made a garden and not put a tree in there that they couldn't have? Then that wouldn't have happened. Then they wouldn't have sinned. So we're going to talk about that. The verse that you're going to be learning this week is Psalm 16:11. So I'm going to read it for you. Some of you will learn the whole thing. Some of you will just learn a part of it. It says this: "You make known to me the path of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore." Now there's a word in there that you might have thought something different than what it actually means. So it says, in your presence there is fullness of joy. Now, when you first hear that word, you might be hoping it's this word, presents. Do you get those at your birthday? Yeah. And we all like to get presents. Now, there is something actually in here, but I'm going to tell you about it at the very end. So remind me at the very end about the back, and I'll get it back out. But that's not the word we're talking about. And you probably kind of can tell. Says, in your presence there is fullness of joy. Now, presents do make us happy, but the presence that it's talking about here is like when Adam and Eve in the garden were with God. They were able to talk with him. He would come to the garden and they got to spend time with him. So that's what it means in his presence. And so they were experiencing being with God and having joy, and there were pleasures, and they had no sin. So they were in a perfect place, enjoying this perfect life. But as we know in our story, what Genesis tells us about is there was one thing they could not do. We would call it a restriction, something they could not do. So God had supplied all of the food in the garden for them to eat. And so there was probably lots of different kinds of trees with maybe fruit and other things that they were eating. Now, some of you love fruit, and so you might think about, oh, I would love to eat as much as I wanted of my favorite fruit. Some of you, maybe fruit is not your favorite, and so you would be like, ooh, what would I eat if I had to just eat fruit all the time? They probably had other things too. God doesn't tell us everything they had to eat. But there was one tree that they were not supposed to eat from. And so they knew that. God had told them, and they obeyed that for some time. And then we kind of know the story. You remember this probably pretty well, that Satan, disguised like a snake, came and he talked to Eve, and he was trying to get her to question what God had said, because she had never not believed what God said. She trusted God, and she knew what he said was true, and that he made them and loved them, and so there was no reason that she should believe God would do something to harm them. But Satan made her question what God said. And then he even said, because he asked her, are you not supposed to be able to eat all of the trees in the garden? And she said, well, there is one we can't eat. And so then she kind of thought, it made her wonder, well, I wonder why we can't eat it. And she knows what God said. She knows that God said they would surely die. And then the snake, or Satan, actually says, you will not die. So, did you hear that? He actually lied. It was a complete lie from what God had actually said. And so that caused Eve to doubt what God had said. And now she's questioning and she's wondering. And so we know that this caused her to take the fruit, and she ate it. And then she took it to Adam, and Adam also ate it. And in Genesis it tells us that they knew they had done wrong. They knew, the Bible says they knew they were naked, and they had done wrong by disobeying what God had said. So they are going to experience this fellowship that they had with God, that perfect harmony that they had with God was going to be broken. And so you remember that God comes to the garden and he calls for Adam and Eve, and Remember, they were hiding. Do you think God knew where they were? Of course, because God knows everything. But he was giving them a chance to make this right with him. And I asked you earlier, we were going to think about this question. Why was that one tree in the garden? If it hadn't been there, then maybe Adam and Eve wouldn't have sinned. Well, maybe you've asked that question to your mom or dad. I've had my kids ask that question. And our lesson talks about this because God made Adam and Eve in his image. And so because they were made in God's image, they did have the ability to choose. And so God, he has a perfect plan, remember, before time began, of what he is planning. And so part of his plan is to have this tree, and Adam and Eve have the ability to choose if they're going to obey God. And so we know that they chose not to. That Bible tells us that whole event and how that happened, and we just went through it. And when they chose to eat of the fruit, sin entered into our world, and it broke their fellowship with God, and they could no longer be in God's presence because they had sin. And so, if you remember, they were forced out of the garden. God had to remove them and get them out of the garden, and they could not be in that perfect place where they had enjoyed God's presence. And they were no longer going to enjoy his being with God, and the joy that they experienced there was no longer there because they were away from God. We know, though, that God has a plan, even past this, that God has a plan to restore that relationship with them and with all of us through Jesus. And that will take place, but that's going to be a long time from the time Adam and Eve were leaving the garden. So there was going to be a lot of things that happened from then until when Jesus died on the cross. So I want you to remember that God created Adam and Eve, but he gave them the ability to choose. And they weren't just robots and they did anything God said. He did give them that ability to choose. And they did not choose to follow God and his way. They chose their own way. And that's why we struggle with that now, because we have our own sin and we struggle too. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about this present. On Saturday, we're going to meet at 10 o'clock and we're going to have a little drawing. And there's something in this bag, and so whoever comes to the get together on Saturday will make a list, and I'll have one of my kids help me, and they're going to draw out a name of all the people that are there, and whoever name is drawn, we will give that little gift to them. So I hope to see you on Saturday at 10 o'clock, and I hope that you're going to keep working on your Kids4Truth verses, and I will see you on Saturday. Bye.